This is the recorded lecture for November 9th for ornithology. You've taken exam 2 today for November 9th, and we also have a lecture that deals with some birds that you are at least hopefully a little familiar with, the kingfishers and the hummingbirds. I imagine most of you by this point in the semester have seen at least one of those. And the waxwings, hopefully we will have an opportunity to see as well. The first group we're going to talk about are the kingfishers. The kingfishers, comparatively to a lot of other birds, are not very thin in the body. They're a much thicker set bird. You can look at the body of the kingfisher in the picture here, and you can see that it is a larger bodied bird. It has a short neck and a short tail compared to the head and body size, very large head with a very large beak, and the bill is very long and strong for the body size. They have bold markings of blues and greens, and they tend to have red, orange, and white as other colorations in them. Many have a neck area may go around the whole neck, it may just be in the front, that is a pale collar. And this is sometimes really helpful in differentiating the kingfisher from some of the other birds. Around campus, we do have a belted kingfisher. A couple times people have stumbled upon a belted kingfisher by going, it looked kind of like a blue jay, but larger and a very awkward body shape. That is likely the kingfisher you have seen, if that's what you've thought. And their feet are syndactyl, meaning that the outer and middle front toes are actually partially jointed. And they are found primarily in the Old World and primarily on Australia and Asian continents. The greatest diversity of kingfishers happens to be in New Guinea, and these birds, because they eat fish, generally are found living near water. This gives you an idea of the 3 kingfishers found in the United States, and belted kingfisher is likely the one that you will have the opportunity to see. Kingfishers require clear water to find their prey because they do hunt by sight. When they're hunting, they may be hunting from the air, or they may be sitting on a perch over the water, looking around the area, surveying it for food. When they see a food item that they want, they will plunge headfirst directly into the water, diving down, capturing their prey. Then they're going to pick it up and fly back to their perch in order to consume it there. So they're sitting on a perch looking for food, finding the food, diving down and grabbing it, returning to the perch in order to eat it. The belted will sometimes hover 20 to 30 feet above the water and plunge from there to capture their prey, whereas others do this perch plunge diving. The North American species tend to be pretty similar in their foraging, but we find that there are some differences around the rest of the world. Our North American species tend to eat small fish, crustaceans, aquatic insects, reptiles, and rarely some amphibians. The laughing kookaburra is part of the kingfisher group. It eats mice and poisonous snakes. There is a single Old World species that feeds at night. There's another kingfisher that eats snails. We do find that our green kingfisher has the ability, when the water is too murky and muddy for hunting, to hunt insects on land. But it's generally going to do this after there's been a large storm that has run through that has made the water too murky to be able to hunt by sight. The breeding of kingfishers can be quite interesting. It includes the male conducting an aerial pursuit of the female. So he will be flying behind her, trying to get her attention. Eventually, the female will he will have her attention, and she will then adopt the posture of a young kingfisher, like their offspring would, and beg him for food. He will then proceed to give her a fish, and they will then determine that they are a good match if she accepts the fish, and they will mate. This is kind of like many of the other groups that we've talked about that involve some sort of aerial courtship, the female adopting the posture of a juvenile or a young. The male presents her with food, she accepts, they then mate. It seems like for the bird species that, well, for many of the species of birds we're talking about, you can think of that food item that he's passing her as the equivalent of an engagement ring. But what makes their nesting interesting are the different types, or breeding interesting is the different types of nests that they may have. The majority of kingfishers nest in burrows. These burrows are dug in river banks, and they're along where the water is. They may also nest in upturned trees, in the roots of an upturned or overturned tree, or in holes in walls of bridges, or on bridges for that matter. The green kingfisher will use overhanging vegetation and either find a place to nest that has overhanging vegetation to block the entrance, or create some overhead vegetation to block the entrance. But the ringed kingfisher can nest in riverbanks up to 1.6 kilometers from the water. The male and the female will build the burrow together, and they chisel a tunnel that's not very wide, just a few inches wide, and it's about 3 to 10 feet deep. It can take them about a week to complete it, and their tunnel's either going to be horizontal or angled upward. That's going to depend a little bit upon the soil that they're digging in, but also how prone to flooding the area is. You would not want to build your channel going downwards, because if it faced downwards, it would be likely to flood. But if it is horizontal, or where the channel actually, or the tunnel actually goes upwards, it's unlikely to flood as the river waters rise. And their burrows will end in a rounded nest chamber, as you can see in the picture here. The burrows themselves do not have nesting material, so they've dug a burrow and that is where the young will nest. And nest sanitation is basically completely ignored for kingfishers. The belted and the ringed kingfishers will lay one brood a year, whereas the others generally tend to have two. Both parents will be involved in raising the young. Both feed the young until the young are capable of consuming whole prey items on their own. What's interesting is that the males and the females will split the responsibilities for the chicks. The males tend to incubate the eggs in the afternoon while the female feeds, and the female comes back and incubates at night, while then he is free to then feed. So they do split the shift of taking care of the eggs and the babies, allowing them both to have time away from the nest to feed. The young will also need to be taught how to not only consume the prey items, but also how to find them. The belted kingfishers can train their young to fish. What they do is they will kill fish that they then drop in front of them to have their young be able to pick them up. The green will have to play with sticks as they're learning to fish, where they grab a stick and pull it up, throw it back out, grab another one. But the training process is sometimes a little bit more dangerous than we would like to think that it is. There have been many instances where young kingfishers have been noted to drown during this training process of learning how to hunt. The parents will feed their young for about 3 weeks after fledgling, and then they're going to forcefully remove them from the territory. So they are going to chase them or force them out of their territory, specifically if they're going to have a second brood. For conservation, kingfishers are threatened, like most of the birds we've discussed this semester, by habitat alteration, nest disturbance, and hunting. People used to shoot and trap kingfishers, especially those that were nesting near fish hatcheries, where they were seen as a large threat, or along trout streams, because people didn't like sharing their fish with these birds. The hunting doesn't seem to have done any long-term harm to the population, though. And given our migratory bird laws, it is outlawed now, so it's not a threat any longer. Habitats have also been destroyed through eroding bank control, where we have tried to shore up riverbanks from eroding and thus blocking access to the ability to dig a burrow into the side of a riverbank. Kingfisher populations in part are declining because they are limited by the number of appropriate nesting sites. If there's not enough bank sites and other places to nest, their population cannot grow much larger than what it is now. Belted kingfishers are declining by about 2% per year. They've declined about 46% as far as we can tell since the 1960s. The ringed kingfishers are found primarily in Texas and in Central and South America. They seem to be stable, seem to be doing pretty well. Same thing for the green kingfisher, who is found in Central and South America as well as Texas and through Argentina now. Outside of the United States, these birds are not protected by the migratory bird laws, so shooting by hunters may be a threat elsewhere. Our next group of birds that we're going to talk about are the waxwings. I don't know if any of you have seen a waxwing yet, but these birds are hard to mistake for anything else. And during the mid to late fall, you may see them occurring in large groups eating berries all together on a branch. These birds eat primarily berries. They are found frequently in flocks, and no other bird has this same upright posture of the waxwing. They also have a head crest and a very interesting body structure. They are gray and brown in color. That head crest can go up similarly to that of a cardinal's. They have relatively plump bodies with small legs, small feet, and their bill is wide and notched. They are always found, it seems, they're almost always found in large groups, especially during the winters and the falls. Very cohesive flocks. They're very close together even when flying. And their tail generally has a yellow waxy band at the bottom of it. Sometimes that yellow is more of an orange color, but that will depend a little bit on what they've been eating. The Bohemian waxwing and the cedar waxwing are the ones that you are likely to see. And you can note that they look very similar to each other, and in both of these pictures they're found with berries. I have observed cedar waxwings at the Heinz Refuge, and they were all eating berries, passing them back and forth to each other. And berries are their main food source. So not shockingly, they feed on sugary fruits. They feed reliantly on fruits from fall through early spring. So 7 months out of the year, they're eating fruits. During the summer, they will add insects to their diets, but fruits are still a dominant food for them. Because they eat fruits, their habitat is going to be anywhere where they can find fruit crops. That's a place where they can survive. They live on food that is a patchy resource. Where you find berries, there's usually a lot of them, and then you'll find an area where there's not many, and so forth. And because of that, they migrate in large flocks. We think. We know that they exist in large flocks, and we know they eat patchy food. We think that flocking behavior may have evolved as a byproduct of their diet. That in order to find food, you needed to know where the patches of food were. So the best way to be sure you found patches of food was to be around other birds of your species. So flocks developed. And that makes sense as a hypothesis. It's really kind of hard to test this hypothesis, but we know that flocks share information and that having more eyes to search for food is better, so it's likely that the flocking behavior is at least partially related to their diet. Their feeding behavior is quite simple. They pluck the whole fruit from the branch, and they swallow it. They may pluck the fruit when hovering nearby. When they're hunting insects, they may fly at aerial insects from a perch. They may take insects from vegetation. And the ones that they will capture in flight are usually emerging aquatic insects, so hatching mayflies or other things like that. And they will generally be able to attempt to, and generally can, swallow an entire berry in one thing. They're not going to bite pieces of it. They're going to try and swallow it. Their mouth structure can open much larger than it appears that it should be able to. And we cannot talk about waxwings without talking about their wing colorations. The wing waxy droplets are unique to this family, and most of the work that's been done on them has been done on cedar waxwings. They have red waxy droplets at the end of the secondary flight feathers in the adults. And we have determined that this color comes from the carotenoid pigments in the diet of the fruits. The carotenoid pigments tend to be in the red and yellow colorations, can also be orange. This is not a color they are making. As a matter of fact, they are picking up this pigment from the food that they eat. The red and yellow colorations seen in house finches and other birds can also be derived from these pigments from food. In the waxwing, the pigments are deposited into expansions of the rachis beyond the body of the feather. When you study waxwings, you find that the immature have few to none of them, and the juveniles may have smaller amounts of deposits. The adults have the greatest amount of deposits as they've been eating the berries for longer with that feather molt. The number and size of droplets will increase with each molt for the first few years. So it takes a while to achieve the droplet structure of the adults. Their tail colorations have the waxy buildup, waxy color buildup, incorporated in the veins at the tips of the feathers. Yellow band across the tip is not the same waxy structure and substance as the droplets on the wings. And you can see in the picture here that we have both a yellow and an orange wing or a tail band. The cedar waxwings with orange tail bands have become common since the 1960s. They're getting that orange color from a new food source, the exotic honeysuckle. The red from the honeysuckle is incorporated in with the carotenoid pigments as they're laid down in the tail. We find that most waxwings with this orange tail coloration are the first year or the younger of the adult birds. And it appears that as they get older, they either eat less honeysuckle or they eat more things, which will dilute that orange color back to a yellow tail band. For breeding, for waxwings, their breeding season is a lot later than a lot of other bird species. They tend to breed in the late summer area, late summertime period or midsummer, because what initiates the breeding season for them is the midsummer ripening of fruit. They're not going to want to breed unless there's going to be significant food supplies to feed to their offspring. Their eggs are laid from early June through August, and active nests have been found even in the month of October. They breed in open wood areas, near streams, or near still water, because they need to be near water sources so they have access to aquatic invertebrates or aquatic insects in order to get that protein source of food. And the edges of a woodland area tend to provide access to both water sources and fruit sources. So they tend to prefer woodland edges as the best type of environment for nesting. They have access to everything they need that way. The conservation of the waxwings is basically been research focused on the cedars as well. These cedars do seem to be increasing across the continent in North America because, well, successional habitat's increasing, which tends to have a lot of fruiting bushes. And these fruit shrubs increase in abundance, so the waxwing population can as well. The reason for regrowth is because we're seeing regrowth of forested areas, but also regrowth of shrubland on agricultural fields. Another thing that has helped the waxwings is eliminating the use of DDT from agriculture, which was impacting the aquatic insects that they ate and the other insects that they ate. So the removal of that has helped with the population increase. That elimination of DDT has helped to increase the Bohemians as well. They were vulnerable to DDT from feasting on insects. The cedar waxwings do seem to be vulnerable to being hit by cars or flying into windows because they tend to feed near roadsides and near woodland edges. The Bohemian waxwings seem to have a very stable population right now. Neither the cedar nor the Bohemian waxwings are a concern for extinction or endangerment. Their populations seem to be rather good. This brings us to hummingbirds, which are our last bird for today. The hummingbirds are the smallest of all birds, weighing in at a grand total of 0.1 to 0.3 ounces. Very tiny birds. Slender bills. They will hover, and their wings are actually going to move in a figure-8 pattern as they do. The males have bright iridescent feathers, bright colored throat patches, and they are able to flash these colors at females during courtship. The females in the immature hummingbirds are very plain and drab in coloration, and hummingbirds are found from the tropical rainforests to deserts to mountain meadows. And the greatest diversity, shockingly, of hummingbirds in the United States is in the southeastern Arizona mountains. So near the desert, we have the greatest abundance of hummingbirds. Hummingbirds are not like anybody else. We have placed them with the swifts because of morphology and genetics saying they belong there. But these birds are smaller. Their bill is slenderer. They can hover and feed when hovering. And they can hover for extended periods of time, so they're not really a swift, but they do have similar morphology because they have small, weak feet and weak legs, and their genetics are similar. But the hummingbird family, even though you've all likely, if you've seen one species, is one of the largest in America with over 320 species with 100 genera. And most of these have a few species. There's no one genus that is dominant. They're kind of splattered, or they're kind of mixed all throughout. This gives you an idea of some different types of hummingbirds. The calliope, blue-throated, you likely have not seen. You've probably seen the ruby-throated if you've seen a hummingbird, but they are quite beautiful. And what you should be able to see from these pictures is the bright colored and the iridescent color of some of the feathers of these hummingbirds. And what you also can notice is that long, narrow beak. Hummingbirds are very adapted for the type of lifestyle that they have. They feed while hovering. So they're going to feed not while flying, but hovering, meaning that they're staying in the same exact place. And they feed on nectar. What allows this is the unique figure-8 movement of the wing, where it moves forward, backward, sideways, up, down, and also upside down. That wing is going to move in a figure-8 pattern, allowing the bird to hover in place, keeping it up in the air, which is why it has to hover, but not moving it because those movements all keep it in the same exact location. One of the other interesting adaptations of hummingbirds is their ability to go into torpor. So they can suspend all body functions if it gets too cold by entering into torpor. They can also enter into torpor when there's food deprivation, or if they're energy stressed, like they haven't eaten enough and it's a little chilly that night. Their normal body temperature is 104 to 111 degrees Fahrenheit, and their heart normally beats at about 250 beats per minute. In torpor, they drop down to 55 degrees for their body temperature and 50 beats of their heart per minute. It's a pretty big difference. When they're flying, though, their heart is beating at 1,250 beats per minute. So their hearts are beating constantly as they're doing this, and they really have to worry about the fact that their heart is constantly in motion this much. Imagine your heart beating at over 1,000 beats per minute. You probably learned, if you learned about hummingbirds, you probably learned in school that they eat nectar only, that they're nectivores. That's what they feed exclusively on. However, we've also discovered that they eat invertebrates. So they are not only nectivores, they eat nectar and invertebrates. They will take fruit flies, gnats, mosquitoes, thrips, aphids, spiders, maggots, caterpillars, ants, eggs of insects. Basically, any invertebrate they can swallow, they will take. And many of them they may get as they are feeding on nectar. They will eat nectar from a variety of flowers and from artificial feeders. Their preferred amount of sugar in nectar is about 20% sucrose solution. It is true that red feeders are more attractive to hummingbirds. So if you're going to have a hummingbird feeder, make it red. However, nectar is typically low in sugar. It's about 20%, so it's not as high in sugar content as you're expecting. The thing you must not do if you're trying to feed hummingbirds is use red food coloring or red food dyes in order to make their sugar water red. It's not actually going to be a bigger enticement to them. The red flowers at the feeder, fake plastic flowers, are an enticement. But the red food coloring we do not believe is actually good for them, specifically because a lot of what's used in the commercially available nectar solution is not even the same food grade that you would eat. So it may be problematic for them. Hummingbirds, as they get nectar, are also good pollinators. They put their face, their mouth into the flower, and as they're sucking up the nectar, some of the pollen is going to get all over them. As they move to the next flower, they take that pollen with them and leave some of it there, thereby moving pollen from flower to flower to flower as they go through their rounds looking for food. And we've discovered that hummingbirds do in fact do rounds. They have a daily sequence of plants that they visit in a specific order. And that is how they go about collecting their nectar, in the same pathway. And we have discovered that it's not just in the same pathway day after day. They take the same path and they stop at the same locations year after year as they migrate. There are people in Arizona who've put out bird feeders for hummingbirds that find the same hummingbirds coming back year after year after year, and somehow bringing more of their friends with them year after year after year. It's amazing that the hummingbirds are capable of remembering and getting to these locations, especially given the size of their body and how likely to be knocked off course they are by a strong wind. When they feed nectar, they will use their long tongue. The tongue is going to be extruded far beyond the bill tip, so the tongue is going to go far beyond the mouth, or the opening to the bill in the mouth, and it will reach the nectar at the bottom of the flower. They will lap up the nectar, and their tongue acts somewhat like a straw. They don't suck it up the tongue, but the capillary action of the nectar moving up the tongue is going to keep moving it into the bird's mouth. As they eat the nectar, they will ingest some insects. They can also grab insects out of the air. We call that a hawking behavior, as they grab it out of the air. They can perch on twigs, scan for insects, and then grab one as it flies by and swallow it whole. And when they are really hungry for insects, they may, in fact, fly and check out what are in spider webs, or on leaves or branches. And they will just grab them out of these structures. Leaves and branches are easy to grab insects off of. But hummingbirds must be careful when grabbing insects out of spider webs. There are multiple accounts of hummingbirds that have gone to grab an insect off of a spider web. They've been entangled in the spider web themselves and starved to death while attached to the spider web. So going after insects in a spider web is quite dangerous for hummingbirds. Most other birds would not find it dangerous because they would be able to fight their way out of the spider web. But remember the size of the hummingbirds and the little amount of weight that they have. Most hummingbirds will breed in their first spring. So they were born the summer before and they're going to breed that next spring. If a male hatches late in the summer, he may not have the opportunity to breed his first year because he may not have attained the full breeding colorations or have learned enough songs to be attractive to the females. Males and females occupy their own territories for hummingbirds. The male picks a territory that has a lot of food sources, so the females are going to come to his territory, and the female picks a territory near a male that has a good nesting site. They don't form any pair bonds. There's no real romance for the hummingbirds. They mate and they move on. So the female finds the male attached to her territory, mates with him, she goes off, lays her eggs, and raises them on her own. Males can even abandon a territory if it doesn't have enough food sources to attract enough females and go start over and attempt to find another territory. So there's no real romance to the life of the hummingbird. It's find a territory if you're a male that has good food to attract some females. If you're a female hummingbird, you find a territory with a good nesting site, they mate and move on. We term this type of behavior when it comes to mating as being promiscuous. Males will attempt to breed with any female on their territory, and they will use vigorous and violent attempts to get rid of a trespassing male. They will vocalize at him, starting with warning notes, and increasing the tempo and the speed of the noises as they become more and more agitated. They will raise their feathers up to flash the iridescent colors at the interloper. They may even physically assault them by dive bombing them and chasing them to the ground with their beak. It's rare that permanent damage is done, but that's usually enough for a male to give up his attempt at a territory. However, in some studies, the original male has sometimes been the one displaced by this being driven to the ground process. Males spend a lot of time defending their territory and can lose up to 20% of their body weight during breeding season from defending their territory and focusing on mating. They're focused on defending their territory and finding females to mate with, not eating. And in part, this is why we think that in the ruby-throated hummingbird, the females live 25% longer than the males do, because they're not as prone to losing weight throughout the breeding season. The female breeding behaviors are a little bit different. Females select territory that's based on good nesting sites. Food resources matter, but so does having a good nesting site. They will defend their nest site against predators and food poachers, like snakes, hawks, blue jays, and wrens. And it's been documented that, yes, a hummingbird will absolutely go after a blue jay if she feels that her nest is threatened. If any of you have been near a hummingbird nest, you may have felt the hummingbird coming after you. What it will do is buzz around your head, flying around you, making a buzzing noise almost with its feathers, trying to get rid of you. They'll do the same thing to cats and dogs. If they feel that they are more threatened or that they're trying to get rid of a rival, they will do U-shaped dives with lots of loud noises to drive off a threat that's a large predator, or in fact, a threat to their nest that's another female hummingbird. Now, I've mentioned the iridescence of hummingbird feathers a couple times now. And they do have iridescent feathers. They have very brightly colored feathers. But that iridescent means that they're going to have this shimmer and shine to them. This is seen on the head and kind of the bib and neck feathers of the adult male. The gorget feathers there being the throat. Iridescent feathers, though, are only going to be seen by someone who's right in front of the bird, where the bird is lined up with their line of vision. Now, how exactly are they iridescent? It's not that the feathers themselves are, but it's the way that they reflect the light. So the feathers have the ability to amplify different wavelengths of light and reflect those lights back in front of the bird. They do this based on their feather structure. The tip of their feathers is iridescent. Unlike a lot of the other feathers that we've talked about, the barbules and the barbs do not lie flat, so they're not zipped in well together. Instead, they have layers of microscopic discs with air bubbles. And these air bubbles will help to amplify the right wavelengths of light and cancel out the wrong ones, thereby increasing the impact of the light. We find that the 3D structure from the barbs and barbules and the layers of microscopic discs give rise to the iridescence. And different species have different iridescent colors because of different colors in the feather, yes, but also because of different structures to the barb and barbule 3D effect and the air bubbles. Hummingbirds will build nests. The female builds the nest. She'll build it on a branch, sometimes a cactus. She'll construct it out of thistle and dandelion down, using hair, feathers, rootlets, bark, very light materials, sometimes even dryer lint, and carpet fibers. She may reuse a nest from year to year. She may reuse someone else's nest that was left in the area. And once she's constructed her nest, she will use spider webs to glue everything together wrapped around the outside, and then lichen and bark stuck to the outer edges to act as camouflage. These nests are going to be against a structure, and they're going to be pointing upwards. Unfortunately, nesting of hummingbirds can be disrupted by rain, and sometimes after long downpours, nests are failed. The young will drown, or the eggs will get washed out, or the nest will be destroyed. So rain is a big threat to nesting, especially large rain. When the young hatch out, they are naked. They're altricial. And when the female is gone from the nest, there's no protection for the young. Remember, the females are raising their babies entirely on their own. The females may renest after a nest failure, but this leads to a later brood, which means that their offspring then may not be able to breed the next year. A recent study from Arizona studied something quite interesting about hummingbird nest selection. Female hummingbirds tend to nest near hawks, and people were quite confused about that because hawks should be a threat. But hawks don't go after hummingbirds. Hummingbirds are even worth it, really. They're too small of a snack. So why might these hummingbirds be nesting near the hawks? Well, it turns out that the hawks chase off Mexican jays. So the hummingbirds were nesting near the hawks because the hawks were actually protecting them from the jays. So by nesting near a hawk that was already fighting with a Mexican jay, the hummingbird could have a nesting site free of jays. Hummingbirds do migrate, and most of those found in the United States will winter south of the US in Mexico. There are now 12 species that will winter in southwest and southeastern United States, but there's still, 300 and some that migrate outside of the United States. And most of the migrating hummingbirds travel over land, with the exception of the ruby-throated hummingbird, which crosses the Gulf of Mexico in one single non-stop flight. As they prepare for this flight, they increase their fat reserves of their body, doubling their weight in about 7 to 10 days. The majority of the time flying over the Gulf of Mexico, they are a nocturnal migrant, going completely at night across a very large body of water. For such a tiny bird, that's a massive journey. Most of our hummingbirds have high fidelity to their migratory routes, meaning that they're going to use the same ones year after year after year after year. Such high fidelity, in fact, that bird studies that focus on banding birds, where they put up nets and they catch all of the birds flying through an area, can find the same exact bird on the same day of the year migrating each year. We don't know how hummingbirds do their migration though. They must inherit it. There's some inherited guidance system because the first year young that have been born that summer are able to migrate, and they go to the same place where they need to go to winter, even though they've never been there before. They don't migrate as a group, so it's not capable that they're learning it from others. They're not going as a flock. Migrating hummingbirds are actually really unfriendly. They'll fight with each other. They're aggressive because they're concerned about making sure they have enough food. So somehow they're born knowing where to migrate to. Long distance vagrancy is pretty common in hummingbirds though. By that meaning it happens often, not that lots of them do it every year. And we believe that hummingbird feeders being hung up and giving birds another place to get food may be one reason for this vagrancy, and perhaps also for one of the reasons why hummingbirds are being encouraged now to stay in the United States, because they're able to get food year-round due to the hummingbird feeders, when usually they may not have been able to do that. Our last slide for today deals with hummingbird conservation. I've mentioned that there's a lot of hummingbirds in the United States, lots of different species, but the population size of most species isn't well known. These aren't birds that you see for very long, and they're birds that tend to be somewhat secretive. They're small in size, they fly rapidly, their vocalizations are really quiet, they have small ranges, some species are really poorly known at all, and they're really difficult to study, so we don't have much information on them. We know that the habitats they use in Mexico and some in California have been lost by significant percentages. So our assumption is that that is a major threat to many of the species. None are currently listed as endangered. Some we've seen declines in their numbers. Some of them just have small ranges, so we're concerned about them. Habitat loss and destruction are hummingbirds' main threats to conservation. But they can adapt to most other things. And we have found that artificial feeders and planting gardens planting gardens that are full of hummingbird attracting plants can support an increase in population that could allow them to rebound somewhat. But because these tend to be in urban areas, it does carry a risk that they may die in window collisions or in a number of studies due to house cats getting them from feeders. And these feeders do not cause delays in migratory behavior. They may cause them to pause, they may cause them to go to a different location, but they do not cause delays in migration itself. For hummingbirds, these are a bird though that people are concerned about or care about because they are small and cute. So that will actually help with their conservation status because people will always want these birds to be around.